Yeah, just looking over my Twitter feed, that's rather fascinating stuff. The response to Greg Jackson, and what I thought was the funniest response was somebody said, I wasn't thinking of voting this year, but I just discovered that there's a fourth-degree coven witch running. Oh boy, I need to get to the polls. So, I love it. Oh my! In our chat room, Pat Sweeney posted the woman as witch stereotype in modern early England, and it's actually, this is serious stuff. The various forms, the misogyny, the hatred of women, or the fear of women. Actually, I think is most misogyny, in my opinion, is at its root not an explicit hatred-driven hate of women, but a fear-driven hate of women. Just like most racism is not just fell out of the sky magically. Hey, let's be angry with people of a different race, but it's a fear of people of a different race, which then, in order to deal with the emotion of fear, it gets converted into hate. And so you have racial animus and you have gender animus. But the history of hatred of women in this country is a long one, and the maltreatment and abuse of women in this country is a long one, and of people of color as well. I mean, this has been, this is a country that has, for a long, long time, has been basically of, by, and for white men. And in my opinion, when Donald Trump says, "Make America great again," he's saying, "Make America white again." And people wonder, why is it all of a sudden there's all this kind of like hysteria around this? It is that from the 1880s, I think it was 1888 was the Chinese Exclusion Act. It might have been 1886, but it was sometime in the 1880s. Congress passed a law that said that the railroads could no longer import Chinese workers to break strikes. It was the first time that a race or a racial group had been singled out legislatively for exclusion from the United States. And frankly, the only time in the I believe, in our history. But not quite. Because in the 1920s or early 1930s, and I apologize for not having the date right in front of me. I haven't, I didn't sit down and say, let's do this as a segment today. Let me do my research. So but I think this is an important thing to comment on. But I'm doing it off the top of my head. But sometime in the 20s or 30s, we passed the first immigration laws. My grandfather came to this country along with his three of his four brothers. One had Down syndrome, and he stayed back in Norway. But my grandfather came to this country in 1917. And at that time, anybody could come to the United States. It was except Chinese, and it was mostly white Europeans. These waves of immigration of white Europeans. They felt welcomed here, and they had enough wealth to be able to get here. And so sometime in the late 20s, early 30s, we passed an immigration law, but the immigration law essentially said that we are going to set immigration quotas, for how many people can come into this country, and those quotas must reflect the racial makeup or the ethnic makeup. I think it was, described at the time more ethnic than racial, but the effect is the same, of the United States as it was. And so at that time, the United States was, let's just pull percentages out of the air that might be close, 80% white, 15% black, 5% Hispanic and Asian. And so, the number of people who could come in and legally immigrate into the United States was within those categories. So from the 1920s, roughly, until the mid-1960s, the legal immigration into this country reflected the racial composition of this country. In other words, it was designed to keep America white. And then in the 1960s, we changed that immigration law so that the criteria for determining who could come to this country was no longer ethnic or racial background. And the consequence of that was that starting in the 1960s, a lot of people started emigrating to the United States. I mean, it was a whole lot easier to get to the United States in the 1960s than it was in the 1860s. You didn't have to raise the money for an ocean voyage, and, you know, there wasn't, you know, so, you know, people from, you know, relatively poor parts of the world, in quotes, you know, Africa, India, Asia, South America, they could get a discount airplane ticket and you know, make it here without huge expense. And so what happened is you know, between that and the end of Dwight Eisenhower's Bracero Law, which kind of led right to Reagan's 1986 amnesty for 5 million people, Hispanics who were here, mostly from Mexico. You combine these things, and it's like the browning of America. So starting, I think it was last year, maybe it was the year before, there are more babies being born now whose skin is darker than mine than babies being born whose skin is as white as mine. In, you know, in a variety of different categories. And this is, Pat Buchanan wrote a book about this. And he said, you know, this is a threat to our Judeo-Christian heritage, which is code for white heritage. And our country started becoming browner and browner. And people with a little more pigment in their skin started showing up in our media. I mean, prior to really, you know, in a fairly real way, prior to Norman Lear, the only black faces that you saw on TV, or Hispanic faces for that matter, or Asian faces for that matter, that you saw on TV were either playing bad guys or they were playing some sort of caricatured stereotype that was denigrating to those people. And Norman Lear put on, and, you know, there was a certain amount of stereotype still then. I mean, you know, this was the 70s, but it was pretty groundbreaking stuff, putting people of color, putting black people on TV, not as buffoons and not as bad guys, but as people. And that, you know, grew, you know, the Cosby Show and other things like that. And now you've got people of color in the White House. You've got people of color on the news. You've got people of color in media, in movies. You got movie stars. You got TV stars. I mean, it's just, you know, the last Academy Awards being the exception, I guess. But, you know, we're waking up, right? We're becoming that great melting pot that we always gave lip service to, but actually prevented by law until the 1960s. And so what's happening is there's a bunch of white people who are sitting around going, you know, geez, the country's getting browner. Now, if we hadn't had 35, 40 years of Reaganomics, that may not produce anywhere near the backlash that you're seeing right now. It may be that, you know, if wages, I mean, you know, wages had followed productivity from the George Washington administration to the Ronald Reagan administration. So as, you know, with the invention of the steam engine, you know, the Industrial Revolution, the digital revolution, at every step along the way, up until the 1980s, as we became more productive, people's wages went up. And the number of hours that they worked went down. And the standard of living went up. But Reaganomics changed all that. Reaganomics was, you know, for the first time, we embraced a radical political philosophy referred to, or an economic philosophy referred to by George Herbert Walker Bush as voodoo economics, trickle-down economics, supply-side economics, Reaganomics, libertarian economics, conservative economics, call it what you want. It was something that had, you know, not really seriously been tried before. It doesn't work. We've had them, we've had the experiment. Sam Brownback tried it in Kansas. It didn't work so badly that he shut down the committee whose job it was to keep track of how successful it was going to be. Doesn't work. So now you got white people who are saying, for the last 30 years, my paycheck has not gone up, but my expenses have. Who's responsible for this? And then you get somebody like Donald Trump coming along going, it's brown people from Mexico and I'm going to build a wall. And you get people like David Duke saying, and it's black people who want to take your job, right? I mean, that's been the hit. It's been the white racist hit, the Klan hit ever since forever. I mean, ever since the end of the Civil War. And then you get, the latest was this 2-minute ad from the Trump campaign showing 3 Jews, Lloyd Blankfein, Janet Yellen, and I'm forgetting who the third was, and saying, the people who control the world are trying to screw you, essentially. This anti-Semitic ad. Oh, it's the Jews. And David Duke would be the first to jump on that one. In fact, the last 2 times we had him on, and it's been many years now, and he's not going to be back on any day soon, but he immediately jumped to, oh, it's all about the Jews. So, this is classic demagoguery. Point to another group and say it's their fault, when actually it's the fault of politics. It was a political mistake for us to have embraced Reaganomics and Reaganism. It was a political mistake, frankly, for Bill Clinton to not have repudiated Reaganomics. A political mistake for this to continue, right? And we need to fix that mistake.